Don't at me, I just really love Terence Zidunich. Hello everybody, welcome back to Meddling in Antiquity. My name is Trey and today we're going to be talking about The Devil's Carnival. Before I get into actually breaking down the film itself, I think it's really important to kind of know who's behind the film, the people who worked on it. And you're going to recognize a couple of names if you watched my previous video, my From Market Music, Murder Makes for Dan Fine Folk Music, because it's a lot of the same people involved in that. So first off, we're going to start with the director, who is Darren Lynn Bousman, who a lot of people will know if you're kind of a cult horror fan as the same person who directed Repo the Genetic Opera, but he's also the director of Saws 2, 3, and 4 from 2005 to 2007 in the Saw franchise. So he is the director. It is the film was written by Terence Zidunich, who you will obviously recognize from Repo the Genetic Opera as the grave robber, a kind of favorite character for the entire film. He also portrays the devil in The Devil's Carnival and also is involved with American Murder Song as one of the writers for that. The film itself was actually composed by Sarah Hendelman, who is the other half of American Murder Song. And the other characters are probably some people and names you'll recognize. You have our three major characters that we're going to focus on are John, who is played by Sean Patrick Flannery, Miss Marywood, who is played by Brianna Evigan, and Tamra, who is played by Jessica Lowndes. And then kind of other characters, you have some people you'll see in the carnival itself. We have, oddly enough, Ivan Moody, lead singer of Five Finger Death Punch, the musician Emily Autumn, Alexa Pena Vega, also known as Carmen from Spy Kids, and Paul Sorvino from Goodfellas. So as you can see, it's a very interesting cast, but it's a very cool kind of thing. And it's a very interesting dynamic because Paul Sorvino, despite having played a gangster or a mobster in most films that he's been in, plays God. Quite literally. He plays God in this film. But it's a film that really does kind of explore the very, very interesting theological issues, specifically pertaining to John's character. But before I get into any of that, just kind of giving you a breakdown of the cast and who's in it, let's get into explaining the story and the plot of the film. So the most interesting thing about The Devil's Carnival is that it's not really one story. I mean, there is one story that runs through the whole thing. There is one cohesive thread. However, our three individual characters, Tamra, Miss Marywood, and John, are all kind of separate, smaller stories that happen in the same time in the same place. And each one of their journeys through hell is depicted through a different Aesop's fable, which I think is probably one of the most interesting aspects about the film, is it takes these fables and kind of distorts them in this really interesting, cool way. So I want to start with kind of least to most. In this section, I'm only going to be focusing on Tamra and Miss Marywood because John's section and his story and the reason he is in hell deserves its own section. So starting with Tamra. The first time we see Tamra is in the very beginning of the film when she's getting ready to leave her abusive boyfriend who shoots her through the window of her car. She ends up in hell. And it very much kind of seems like her crime is that she's just really gullible and overly trusting. And her fable that she is kind of encapsulated and described by is the Scorpion and the Frog. And which is one of my favorite sections of the film because it gave my favorite song in the entire film, which is Emily Autumn's song, Prick Goes the Scorpion's Tail, which I've actually performed burlesque to. Her story is very interesting, and her whole thing is she's too gullible. She's really gullible and kind of overly trusting, and that gets her into trouble, and it is part of the reason she died. It's part of the reason she was killed. However, her way of dealing with it is just kind of appeasement, which I think isn't necessarily that bad. It just makes her stupid. And her character kind of intertwines with, well, she shows up in hell and she's dressed in this very pretty kind of costume silk 50s dress that's in a shade of green, and it makes her look a little bit like a little frog. And she meets this character, Scorpion, who is played by Mark Centaur in a very interesting plastic wig. that I really want because I want to perform drag as this and another number from the film's sequel, Alleluia, The Devil's Carnival. But her whole thing is, like I said, she's very trusting, and that gets her killed. Again, over and over again in hell. And interestingly enough, this is the only time we ever see Tamra for the rest of the franchise so far. But her character is kind of the frog, and there's kind of two songs that kind of lead into each other about her, and that is Trust Me, which is the character Scorpion singing to her, essentially narrating the consequences of the actual fable. And then you have Emily Autumn's solo in the film Prick Goes the Scorpion's Tail, which comes directly after that, and that is the story of the fable. It is the fable in song form, which I thought was really interesting and a very fun way to do it. And how they kind of created Prick Goes the Scorpion's Tail is they made it this very upright, fun bar song. It's very much, it's bawdy in a way. It's very fun to listen to. It's really entertaining because Emily Autumn is an incredible performer, and her character Painted Doll is a very interesting character. But I'm not going to get into that now. You have to wait 2 weeks for the story behind Painted Doll. Next we have Miss Marywood, played by Brianna Evigan, and her fable is the dog and his reflection, though it is called The Dog and Her Reflection this. And the first time we meet Miss Marywood is when she is shot to death in a police standoff because she is a jewel thief. Her sin, very obviously, the reason she's in hell is because she's greedy. And that comes through very, very clearly in every action she does. She has no regard for anybody else. And her punishment, I think, is the most entertaining to watch. Because there is a part where she asks for Hobo Clown, played by Ivan Moody's supervisor, because she sees him as just an employee. And when I think about Miss Marywood's punishment in hell, I like to imagine that that's what happens to the white women that get called Karen on Reddit when they go. However, her story is essentially her kind of luring into the trap that is hell is through this character called the Twin, who is played by Ogre. It's very interesting. Because Twin is a character who can change his face into anybody he wants to. And he turns Miss Mary into Miss Marywood. So he's singing this song called Beautiful Stranger to Miss Marywood as she's playing a carnival game where if she loses, she's punished. So she loses because it's hell. She's not going to win. And that leads us into Ivan Moody's solo, A Penny for a Tale, which is essentially telling the story of the dog and his reflection. It's a very good song. It's a very fun song. It's one of my, I don't really have a song I don't like in this film, but it's a good song. It's a really entertaining portion of the film, and I really do recommend it. It's a fun portion, and it's fun to see like the epitome of a Karen be punished in such a harsh way. It's gratifying. It really is. So now that we've gotten our other two out of the way, I want to kind of spend a bit of time on John and why he is in hell, because it's very interesting. You don't really see right away why he's there. And I think that's what makes him probably one of the most compelling characters and why his story is the most compelling and why I keep coming back to the film in the first place. So let's get into John. John is a very complicated character in the film. John's story is, I think, probably one of the more sad ones, and it shows exactly how complicated his relationship with exactly what happened to him and why he did what he did is difficult. So when we first meet John, we see him standing in his bathroom in his home that he shares with his wife, and the reason John is in hell is because he kills himself. John kills himself because of the grief he's feeling over the death of his son. And John's story and his journey through hell is encapsulated in the fable Grief and His Due, which is very interesting because John only has kind of this one song. There are little hints throughout the course of what John goes through when he is in hell. There is one song called Kiss the Girls, and there is, it's a part that kind of talks about exactly what John is kind of, implies what happened to John's son. But we don't really have a 100% clear idea of exactly what happened to John's son Daniel until the last 10 to 15 minutes of the film, when John actually sings a duet with the devil called Grief. And in that, we find out that John's son ran off one night, and a very rainy night, and was hit by a train and died. And you kind of, through listening to the song, you can kind of, part of what the melody and the beat of the song is, it's a train shuffling by. And it's very interesting because then you get to John actually confronting the devil. And it's through that confrontation, I think, comes one of the most meaningful lines in the entire film, which is the devil to John. Because John, obviously, his first instinct is to blame the devil for the death of his son. And the devil's response to that is, I am not in the business of killing innocent children. That's God's jurisdiction. And I think that is such an important line, and that alone I could probably spend a good 10 to 15 minutes breaking down on its own, but I don't think I need to. I think it speaks for itself. In the context of this film, it is three people finding their ways through hell. This man who was so overcome with his own grief that it led him to kill himself, with his own guilt that it led him to kill himself. And his first instinct is to, of course, blame the devil. But the devil doesn't have any control over what happens to our lives. In the context of this film, the devil is just the excuse. He isn't the reason. Because everyone always talks about, and I think this is a huge important thing, that's the point the film is trying to make, is everyone talks about how everything must be God's plan. Even the death of a child, it's quote-unquote God's plan. Which is why I think it's such an important distinction that the devil pointed out, that he's not the one who does the killing, he's just the one who takes the guilty. He deals with the guilty, and that's another thing the devil says. He only deals with the guilty. He doesn't have anything to do with anybody else. It's God that does all the killing, God that does the smiting, God that does the murder. And that, I think, is probably the most poignant part of the entire confrontation, the entire conversation between John and the devil. Because John isn't actually in hell because he killed himself. And something that he expresses just before the film ends, essentially, John is there because he's of not just his guilt over the death of his son, not because he killed himself, but because he feels guilty because he feels like his son should not have been born in the first place. And it's part of the breakdown that John has in front of the devil at the end of the film that really kind of encapsulates, he's not guilty for any of the reasons you think he is. He's guilty because he feels like he didn't love his son enough when he was still alive. Not because he killed himself. It's because he felt like he abandoned his son emotionally before his death and didn't really get a chance to make up for it. And I think that's why this film is so interesting to watch and so important to watch, because of that specific message. Is like, it's a lot deeper of a film than a lot of people think it is. And I feel like if you watch the film, I'd pay really close attention to John, because John is, I think, if there's going to be a main character, it's John, hands down. Now that we've kind of broken down all the stories and the smaller things in the film, let's get into final thoughts. I always tend to recommend Devil's Carnival to people if you want kind of an easy kind of slide in to kind of cult classic films, because one of the best parts about the movie is it's easy to digest, the music is good, and it's under an hour. With credits included, it is less than an hour long. It is less than an hour long film, and it's really worth the watch because there's a lot of really deep things that you have to keep watching the movie over and over again to kind of understand and process in your head. And I think that's the mark of an incredible film, and that they can do that and they can make that impact in less than an hour, I think is something that really deserves praise. It's very praiseworthy. Darren Lynn Bousman is an incredible director, and Terrence Zdunich is a phenomenal writer, and everything about the film is really incredible, whether you believe in one god or any god at all. I think it's a really important thing to watch, because I think it really does make several points in regards to Christianity and theology that are incredibly valid and incredibly poignant without being too obvious. So I do recommend giving it a watch. It is on iTunes. It is a very good movie. It is one that I'll kind of always recommend. And shout out again to Isaac, who I shouted out in my Penny Dreadful video, who introduced me to Penny Dreadful, also introduced me to the Devil's Carnival. So that about wraps us up for this episode of One Off Wonders, and I will see you all on Monday for our next episode of Marked Music.